I have a deep, abiding fear that I've never accomplished what I set out to do. Even though I have seen the effects of my actions and seen how the world is shaped in my wake, I also wonder, why can't I make it happen on purpose? Why can't I get the results that I want? The closest you'll ever get to perfection is a feeling of completion. Your gut instinct about when something is done should not be overrated. Perfectionism is a form of narcissism. Believing that you are somehow capable of perfection, even in the realization of your own intent, or even capable of defining or recognizing your own intent in a way meaningful to anyone else, is total hubris. Aspiring to any ideal first requires belief in one ideal, superseding all other ideals. You kind of have to think you're better than everyone else, at least at doing whatever you're trying to do, and without realizing that you always will be by matter of course. I don't really believe in validating one's existence. I think from an evolutionary standpoint, your birth contributed all of the data that it had to for the species' advancement, and that's as close as I personally have to any instinctive sense of a moral good. You were born. Good job. Most people don't even feel this way about themselves, though, much less anyone else, and especially anyone farther than themselves from their own ideal. Even being interested in others has a kind of odd narcissism to it. You could just go about your day, but you feel a need to involve other people, even if it's only on the level of listening to what they have to say. But how much you care depends on proximity to your interest. You are engaged when you feel involved. It's hard to care about something that you can't understand or which has nothing to do with you, and deciding that you must care is an act of arrogance. Why do you need to involve yourself unless you believe this should have something to do with you? I think an element of narcissism is inherent in the human experience, and only something we label when someone doesn't care to realize how everyone else is reining it in. Sometimes a perfectionist is a ruthless abuser, like the archetype perfectly defined by J.K. Simmons' performance in 2014's Whiplash. But more often, their ideal recognizes inclusivity, and so they task themselves on top of doing perfect also to inspire perfect, to work perfectly with others, and to be never failing in interaction at any scale. They often feel empathy to the shortcomings they recognize in others, but rarely for those who don't seem aware of or intent on improving their own. A perfectionist is holding themselves to such high standards that they start to think that the only thing impeding their vision is the fact that so few other people are also holding themselves to high standards. And so they feel comfortable in abusing those people, because they would abuse themselves in the same ways if they found themselves guilty of the same shortcomings. Worst of all are critics, who are so afraid of failing to make something great that they can only commit to espousing the greatness of whatever they recognize for closer approximating their own ideals, and otherwise admonish anything which feels inferior to them to what their own intent would be should they actually do something. Here I am, a critic, shitting on critics, normalizing public emotional self-flagellation right before your eyes in a vain effort at proving how I'm a deep writer. Is it working? Like, comment, and subscribe if it's working. My Patreon, Substack, Ko-fi, Backed By, and Twitter are all linked below. Why aren't I better than this? What do I need to do to be as great as I think I'm supposed to be? Ideas like this have always haunted me. Perfect Blue, Act 1. As I boot up Perfect Blue on VLC, I can hardly believe it is only 80 minutes long. It is unbelievably tight to fit in so much detail in such a short time, and I want now to own the storyboard so I can pore over it again and again to figure out how this was accomplished. Short and punchy stories are my favorite, but this one takes me on such a journey with so much to think about that I've never considered it as short. For the first 13 minutes, the film details the death of Mima's career as an onstage pop idol, whose ghost will haunt her for the next months of her life until the thrilling conclusion of this film. There's a lot to unpack about the particular presentation of Mima's retirement from the idol scene, and luckily I feel well prepared to do it because this is, for me, one of the most unfortunately relatable films in the world, and one I think I have an uncommon level of perspective on with which to comment. Like in the case with Mima, some aspect of the creative arts and ambitions within that industry have always been with me. In the conversation with her mother at the end of this scene, she is reminded how she always wanted to be a singer, and about all of the work which she's put into trying to accomplish this goal. But Mima steadfastly reassures her mother of her disillusionment with the career of a pop idol, stating that her mother doesn't really understand the inner workings of the industry which are driving her decisions. I had a conversation like this with my dad this morning. I think a key aspect of this film's mystery is how it never exactly declares what Mima really wants. There is a moment when her producer and manager are fighting over whether she should go fully into acting or continue her singing career on the side, which ends in the manager, who wants Mima to keep singing so much that she's going to make the rest of the movie happen, asking that they consider Mima's feelings. The film cuts away, but the implication is that she really did want to leave the idol industry behind, and frankly, everything about the scene of her last concert makes that seem like the correct decision. It's easy to be sympathetic to Mima for me because I understand her position, but I wonder how other viewers will look at the way that she ends her career. There's a moment after she's retired and packed away her band's poster when she opens up some fan mail that says, "Please sing for us forever," to which she verbally responds, "I can't do that though." I can understand her feelings, but Mima never actually shares those feelings with the fans. She never explains to them why she's leaving or what any of this ever meant to her in the first place, really. In her perspective, she's making the logical choices based on circumstances as she understands them. But her fans don't have that perspective, and since she never shares it with them, she leaves them with a sense of abandonment, a feeling like the reasons they connected with her were always secondary to her personal desire to move through the industry. When you can't explain yourself, people are left to assume whatever they want. And when you can't explain yourself well, they'll fill in the gaps in what you said. Obviously, Mima's privacy should be respected, but in your own way, when you create art for the public, you are opening a door into their lives and invading their emotions. You are demanding that of all of the things that could occupy their time, money, and love, they should choose you. It's broadly begging for trust. And when you get that trust, you are creating a bond that you can't really understand and should never underestimate with your audience, because everyone will be affected differently. You can't expect people to form the same relationships to your art that you've formed to others' art, because if they did, then they'd also be doing what you're doing, instead of being mystified and enthralled by your work such that they make space for it inside of their hearts. Now imagine I came into your house with this beautiful sofa that you loved right away and were so excited to share with me, until one day you come home and I've burned the couch to cinders and bought this gigantic crock pot, and I tell you that we no longer watch shows on couches in this house. We now make crock-pot together. If you really love my company or you're excited about crock-pot, then this might be a positive development. But if you can't get over your cherished memories of the couch, then you're going to feel more tormented than my metaphors. This is basically what it's like when an artist changes gears. Really breaking down everything going on at the start of this film would require more expertise into mid-90s Japanese pop idol culture than I personally have, but luckily the dialogue itself suggests a lot about the state of the industry at the time. Pop idols having such a huge presence in anime actually represents the way that they've been pushed into the niche avenues of Japanese culture. In the 80s, these groups were legitimately massive mainstream successes within their country, and not playing small stages or depending entirely on a fanatical culture developed over 40 plus years to stay alive. To the people that care about idols, they will never be a dead culture, but to the broad population of Japan, by the mid-90s, the average person didn't care about this type of pop character, and it's obvious that on some level, success and admiration at scale is a part of Mima's goal. There's an interview quote from Satoshi Kon that I've long been obsessed with, where he says that he likes to write about female characters because he doesn't feel that he projects himself into them as much as he does when writing male characters, and so he doesn't seem to make as many assumptions about the character's intent. In Perfect Blue and later in Millennium Actress and Paprika, there is always this sense that while we understand what the characters are doing and why, there's never a proper declaration of intent from the character about what they were hoping to accomplish in doing all of what they do. And I think this lends a lot of the sense of mystery to these movies. Mima's statements to her mother about why she's quitting are too broad and general to really mean much to her mom, and we as an audience only get what she means because we literally just saw it on display. But we are required to make a leap from inference to assurance that we understand what's going on without the character reassuring us in the text of the film. I think Mima wants to be famous and make more money and live an interesting life more than she wants to sing, but she only ever really talks about why she doesn't want to be a pop idol and never really about why she does want to stay in the entertainment industry. An easily overlooked detail in this opening scene is that Mima actually isn't the lead singer of her group. In fact, the one song where she sings leads is described as the rare chance to hear Mima's singing voice by her fans. We need to appreciate, though, that the guys who love Mima's voice are hardcores that have been traveling town to town to see all of the shows, even at little backwater events like what this one at the start of the film is considered to be. These guys are probably of the mindset that Mima just needs more time to shine and maybe could revitalize the band. But I would bet that from Mima's perspective, she's been trying to prove herself as a singer for 2.5 years and hasn't even gotten to be lead on almost any of her group's songs. Regardless how some of her fans may feel, Mima is a failure as a singer in her own perspective. There's a lot of little aggravations that make this seem like a marked low point in the group's career. The film actually opens with a live stage performance of Super Sentai, which is meant to suggest something about the nature of this show that didn't come through to me when I saw this film as a teenager before I knew enough about Japanese culture to recognize what kind of event this is. If you watch a lot of anime, you've probably seen plenty of times where a character attends something like this at a mall or at town fair or any other kind of small local event, which it's worth noting have more people at them just because Tokyo is really dense. It's the most populous city on Earth. And because of Japan only having one-day weekends, meaning that these type of little pop-up events are way more common there and have way bigger turnouts than they would have in the United States. It's likely that the event turnout here is larger than it might have been otherwise too, thanks to the rumors circulating about Mima's upcoming retirement, which my instinct tells me is a rumor that the producer has been spreading to make sure that it actually happens. After all, the hardcore fans are trying to convince themselves that there would have been a more meaningful event to leave on, failing to realize how this is likely as good as it gets for the group at this point. Backstage, as their managers and stagehands rush to ready them, we see frantic unreadiness and incredulity at the state of the costume. It's unmistakable in the artwork how these girls are too old, way too mature looking to be dressed like this anymore. The whole thing has this air about it that's almost pathetic from certain perspectives. Even as hardcore fans, like the obsessed bodyguard, still feel the exaltation of basking in Mima's light. They are still on the couch with her in the home of their own mind. Worst of all about this showing is the group of hooligans who have apparently showed up at multiple shows now to cause problems, one of them going so far as to throw a can at Mima and then starting a huge fight between the punks and the other fans until Mima breaks it up with her announcement of retirement. I am fascinated by these ruffians, and I almost wish we had a little more insight into their motivations since the film gives them not that much dialogue, but I have some suppositions based on my own experiences. I would have thought that these kids were just some local punks if not for the fact that they were at the previous Chime show to cause problems as well, suggesting that this is targeted harassment at the band. Their ringleader throws particular insults at both the obsessed bodyguard and at Mima, one whom he calls just a part-timer and the other whom he calls a no-name. As general as these insults seem to be about the people they're directed at, I can't help thinking this kid knows who both of them are, and he's ultimately disappointed in them. These kids seem younger than the rest of the fans, and so they were probably at a really impressionable point when they first discovered the band, only to become disappointed when they didn't grow and become cool, but instead languish in shithole malls, at least from these kids' perspectives. They want the band, and especially Mima, whom they already probably know is giving up on the band, to just hurry up and end it so that they can be free. They don't want to have to keep seeing this band go lower and lower and become less and less cool. They want the chance to move on. One more note I need to make about this first act of the film is to highlight the almost extreme contrast between the content of the stage plays and the content of the film itself as it portrays the stage play's execution. In both the Sentai show and in Chime's lyrics are all these messages of hope and self-empowerment about conquering evil and seizing your dreams. If you take the lyrics of the first Big Pop song as Mima's message of self-empowerment, it feels exactly like the mindset that would drive one to quit singing pop and go all in on dramatic acting because there's a demand for you to do it. After all, she's singing about being aggressive and impulsive in the pursuit of your dreams. Even though there's a very realistic and palpable cynicism to this whole scene, it's also clear how the soul of someone who sings about things like this would lead them to the decisions that they will make for the rest of the film. Perfect Blue, Act 2. Putting myself in a mid-90s mindset can be a little tricky. I was born in 1991, and my parents had been convinced that they should own a personal computer and internet connection, even though they barely understood how to use one, for the next 10 years. But I was practically the very first person my age ever to step conceptual foot into the internet. When Mima hears in a crowd someone say that they are always looking at Mima's room, just the way that he says it sounds like he's talking about a fan site to me, but Mima does not know about fan sites. Mima is a regular Japanese girl in her early 20s in the early 90s and doesn't even know what it means when her fan mail tells her that they posted a link to Mima's room until she asks her manager about it. It would be really unfair to talk about this film as though I were watching it for the first time, and I'm betting that if you're watching this video, then you either don't care about spoilers or you have seen this film at least once yourself. But it's the classic case in which a film takes on more meaning when you know what's really going on, and so repeat viewings are somehow even more exciting. If you don't know that the manager is the killer, then you're not going to probably pay her too much mind over the course of the movie, which is totally to her intention. Consider how bored and out of it she pretends to be when Mima starts telling her about shit that she's directly involved with and definitely knows about. This woman is a real sociopath, and you know that because of how you'd never know it if the film didn't reveal it to you in the very end. What's really happening throughout this whole film's midsection is a kind of one-sided psychological warfare against Mima perpetrated by her manager, who really doesn't want her to stop singing. If you're watching Mima's first acting gig attentively, it's suddenly a lot more obvious how this woman is hoping to undermine this venture. Totally contrasting the energy that she had in the dressing room before, now she's standoffish and hardly willing to talk to Mima. But Mima isn't registering any of this just because she's become so enthralled in the experience. This one very telling shot has Mima staring at the actress whom she's about to decide that she wants to be just like, while the manager watches her in silent disapproval. Feeling the way that Mima is just getting more interested in this whole acting world and is basically showing no signs of emotional connection to her former career as a singer. Keep in mind that the blank phone call and the creepy fax calling her a traitor over and over that she got just the night before were sent over by this very woman, who is trying to scare her back into a career that she is now seeing Mima has no interest in whatsoever. I am curious to know how many first-time viewers of this film suspected manager Rumi as the criminal from the start. As the more my knowledge of psychology and tropes and mystery have deepened, the more it almost feels obvious now. But that's easy to say when I've known this film for over 15 years and I've seen it at least 3 times. What's really changed, though, is my perspective on what kind of person would have done this. After all, who could be more obsessed with a person and their fate than the people right next to them? And who could be less suspicious to them than someone that they trust? In retrospect, it feels like it only could have been Rumi. Who else would have known that Mima's producer was at the root of Mima's decision to go into acting? If you're seeing it for the first time, the film convinces you that the letter addressed to Mima is for her. After all, would fans understand that someone else checks a star's mail before they get to it? But it doesn't make any sense to target a person that you would want to see back on stage with a letter bomb and a threat as just a warning. Rumi knew that the producer would open the mail, and that he wouldn't want to go to the police about it because it would cause potential problems in her career going forward. I do think that this is a bit much of an incident to be so successfully brushed under the rug, but it's only possible because Rumi considered this as a safe bet, knowing exactly how this scene would play out aside from the fact that it wouldn't scare Mima out of acting. Which should be the dead giveaway of Rumi's involvement instead ends up being another smokescreen, as she teaches Mima to use her computer enough to access the Mima's Room fan site. Knowing what's really going on gives this scene the same energy as episode 50 of The Biggest Problem in the Universe, when Asterios Kokkinos spent an hour trying to configure Skype with the hosts before the start of the show, only to reveal shortly into the show that he had actually flown across country to physically show up in studio, and had gone through all that trouble with Skype in his car just outside as a means of keeping it a surprise until the show started. As a micro-celebrity, when your audience reaches a certain size, no matter how much you might communicate with them on the whole, there's just no accounting for who all knows about you, how do they feel about you, and what form of interaction might they want to choose to take with you. Almost every single person will understand that they are not your friend, lover, or companion, and most of them won't feel that you owe them anything or threaten you to get that thing back. But it only takes one. How could you possibly find that one in the sea of unknown thousands? In actuality, if you're paying attention, you'll figure it out. I think there's something telling actually about the level of disconnect that Mima has with her audience, and how this affects her ability to act over singing, which I'll get into a lot more when discussing the film's ending. But for now, I'll just say that the people who are most obsessed with an artist are either never going to come anywhere near to contacting them for fear of ruining that sacred relationship, or else will be as close as they possibly can so that they can soak up every ounce they can of whatever they're getting from that person. It could even be that they want to be more involved with that person than they want to be involved with themselves, to be defined by their relationship to that person, and to feel only comfort through their proximity to their own image of them. Let us take note of the nature of this scene in which Mima has her first line of on-screen dialogue for some big-time TV police procedural. The actress that she admires is describing a criminal who takes the skin from women and wears it out of a desire to be a woman himself. A hacky take on trans crime, all too common in these types of shows, but one with implications that are more interesting for the story of this film itself. Rumi is very clearly trying to skinwalk Mima, as spelled out in the final scenes when she comes to reflect Mima so much she seems to her as an apparition of her own old self. Likewise with the stalker stagehand, who writes the Mima's Room blog from Mima's first-person perspective about everything that she really does in a day. They both wanted to be the version of Mima that they saw on stage, and had no interest in being Mima the actress, much in the way that many of my fans wanted to be like me when I was calling myself Digibro, and then felt completely lost and betrayed when I transitioned gender and revealed that I wasn't really just like them at all. When Mima reads her fan page, she is stunned in horror. She knows for sure now that she's being stalked, and also that someone is surrounding her with threats and violence, creating a shaky state of psychology that no one's really around to help her to deal with, since the person most involved in her life is actively causing the problems while gaslighting her to not be worried about them. It is noteworthy too how the film cuts directly from her wondering who are you at the computer screen to nailing that same line on the next day of the TV shoot, which she had been stressed and nervous about before. There is a suggestion throughout the background of this film that, in a strange way, the trauma which Rumi causes Mima actually serves to secure her acting career instead of severing it. Mima is talented, but not a terribly complicated person. She tends to draw on her own experiences and ideas, and she struggles with new concepts, as we see when Rumi has to explain to her multiple times how a URL works. Mima turns the feelings from seeing the website directly into her performance, which for me also raises some interesting questions about what Mima's past could have been like that it prepared her to deal with her next scene. Around 25 minutes into Perfect Blue is the slowest scene in the film that exists mostly to reify all of the information we've been given so far and to be sure that we are ready to head into the action. The producer and manager argue more over whether it was worth Mima having left Cham to have such a minimal role on TV, but the producer sees this as the start of something big, while there had never really been major success with Cham. As it turns out, though, Cham has actually gotten a lot more successful since dropping Mima, indicating not only that she shouldn't go back, but probably can't. She has a moment where she remembers when she was excited as a member of the group first celebrating formation, and which only without her is celebrating in the same way about finally achieving success. Meanwhile, Mima's fans are disappointed with how little they get to see her, and Mima herself is mentally deteriorating as she comes to fear everyone around her as potentially the stalker tracking her every move. This is also when Mima's number 2 superfan and the film's red herring antagonist starts making moves. We already knew that the deformed stagehand who tried to stop the ruffians in the opening scene was obsessed with Mima, but after he overhears people in a store jokingly asking someone to save Mima, he decides to become that savior, starting with a hit and run that hospitalizes the punk from before. He sticks a newspaper clipping about this in an elevator and smiles at Mima, probably thinking that he just successfully communicated to her how he has done her bidding by eliminating her worst enemy. We'll get back to this dude later down the line. In the center of this film is the most harrowing scene, and perhaps my favorite, if you can be said to favor something for scarring your mind. I mentioned I was only 13 when I saw this film for the first time, and covering my eyes, only barely peeking through what felt then like this amazingly long scene, depicting something I'd never personally experienced and also never seen in media before. A rape scene. It's a staged rape scene, technically, and handled so artfully and with so many layers of meaning that I doubt another similar scene is more brilliant. If there's any obvious reason this film had to be made in animation instead of live action, it's that this commentary on exploitation would necessarily have had to be exactly as exploitative itself as what it is criticizing, had it been presented in the same fashion. Mima not being a real person is pretty crucial to this scene, achieving uncomfortable art without a sense of overall moral compromise in so doing. Mima's leap into hardcore pornographic rape acting can only be described as extremely accelerationist, and to me it raises the most intrigue into Mima's past. We will see in her outraged scene afterward her outcry that she obviously didn't want to do the scene, but the fact that she was even capable of doing it at all speaks volumes about her nature and willpower, while also leaving me to wonder about her perspective on sex and showing herself in this kind of context before jumping into it. There's a scene where she sort of puts off the drama of the idea, saying that it's not like I'm actually getting raped, right? And she doesn't even seem too haunted by the act of it all until they've had to do a couple of takes and settling into the performance of, well, pretending that you are actually getting raped starts to hit her. After all, if you're really doing your job, then it should feel as if you were actually raped, right? I don't think Mima realized this until she was in the scene, but once she did, she really went all in on embodying the experience, and she doesn't even let slip her real feelings about it until long afterwards, when she finds her fish dead. I've given a lot more of myself away to the internet than almost anyone else would ever feel comfortable with, and I also know that if I thought someone wanted me to act in a rape scene for a lot of money and clout, I would probably do it. I know that because I'm the same kind of sick and demented borderline sociopathic narcissist that Mima is, and that you kind of have to be successful as an actor. Your job is literally to be fake. You're meant to be able to rearrange your ego and embody another one. I've been shirtless and shown my ass online before, but nothing nearly the level of what Mima does in this scene. But however, one of my best friends and sometimes roommates, Mint Salad, is a literal porn actress, and I've seen her do so much crazy shit on camera for the internet that I think I have at least some perspective on how this kind of person comes to be, which mostly is just by having a very different perspective on sex and on showing yourself than what most others have, based on different experiences with those aspects of life in your upbringing. Perfect Blue the movie, I've never read the original book, doesn't tell us enough about Mima's past to understand what exactly is she drawing from that makes her think it's okay to show the world what she would look like in this situation. But however harrowing the experience is, she accepts it and pushes forward with the success that it lands her through the lane that it leads her down. If I found out one day that I could make as much money as Mint Salad does by showing my tits online, I know I'd do it. But you find this kind of thing out when people start asking you to do it. Not very many people were asking Mima to sing, so her producer begged the show writers to find an excuse to get her more screen time. The writer, knowing that Mima is hot, figured that he could justify getting her naked into the show if it's a serious dramatic scene that makes everyone involved look brave for doing it. Mima sees the logic in this, full sends it, and rides the success wave afterwards, acting like she was even less distraught and more enthusiastic about it than she really actually had been, because she knows the results now. This is all natural showbiz. Why this all works boils down to one throwaway line that happens when the rating spike is being discussed. Because the general public are stupid. See titty, click like. It takes a lot of stupid mechanisms to get the same pair of titty to the most people possible, but it tends to look just like what we saw in this film. Most notable to me while watching this again is how uncomfortable literally everyone is about having to do this scene, to the extent that they had to build a set because there wasn't a real club willing to let them film the scene there. It feels uncomfortable in how sterile and real the presentation is, not because it feels like a real rape scene, but because it feels so very much like a real staged rape scene, which is something you don't even realize is so obviously uncomfortable until this film makes you realize the mechanism by which that is staged and created, in all ways but the lack of consent on the part of the actress being functionally identical to if it really happened. We don't see much of how this was shot for the cameras either. Instead, it's all framed at these dry, flat angles that almost rob the tantalization from what Mima's attractive body is doing because we are disengaged from the action. We have the wrong perspective to be getting turned on, and it's obvious somehow in the way that everything is shot. There's almost something funny about the guy getting his zipper caught, until you remember how uncomfortable it was right before that, and that the director tells them to retake the scene from the top. After that, the slurry of imagery the scene devolves into feels like forever inside of a couple seconds. I seriously never forgot how this scene felt since seeing it as a teenager, and it's always been very raw and unpleasant in a weirdly relatable way. Mima's producer clearly feels bad about it, but is reassured by the way that Mima herself seems blankly proud of having done her duty. Rumi is furious, crying and storming off as the image she's been projecting herself onto is literally raped and torn before her eyes, and the stalker flies into a fit of denial, writing from Mima's perspective that she's being forced into all of this and is in need of saving. Both of them will be enacting their own revenge plots on Mima's behalf, intertwining with one another to drive the poor girl completely insane. Nobody particularly wanted to actually do the scene, but everyone involved knew that it would get a lot of attention and help everyone's careers. It's only the people with an emotional stake in who they considered Mima to be, which is contradicted by this depiction, who are ruined by it. Considering the actions either of those characters will take in this film, I can't imagine many audiences are too sympathetic towards them as people, but I'm curious how others feel about Mima's handling of this career turn. It's kind of difficult to be sympathetic to either of these characters even if they hadn't been criminals, because I think it's kind of pathetic to couch so much of your identity in somebody else, or to even think that you can really understand someone else on that level. Partially because I've fucked up and tried to do this myself in the past. Projection is a core aspect of communication, but I don't think a lot of people are very self-aware about how much projection they do, and especially of how delusional projection can make you about someone else's intentions. Instinctively, being that I am in a position like Mima myself, I recognize these villains as my own real-life natural enemies. And I explained all of this mostly as a lead-in to trying to explain what the hell I think is going on in Mima's mind through the midsection of this movie. I'm not really trying to speak on the authorial intent either. I haven't read the original book. I only have Kon's words on the film to go by, which he was deliberately vague about when he was alive. According to Kon, he wanted the film to be confusing and mysterious, such that audiences would have their own takeaway. But the film wouldn't resonate or carry a sense of verisimilitude, which lets it connect with so many people as to appear on lists of the greatest films ever if it really was just a bunch of weird random stuff that's open to interpretation. There is guiding logic behind all of what's happening that's couched in psychological concepts that the filmmakers must have had some grasp on, even if trying to put all of it into words would do disservice to it and jumble the audience's understanding of it too much to actually connect emotionally. If I said something like that Mima might be schizotypal, for instance, it's such an oversimplification, and it asks the audience to project so much of their own understanding of that term into the conversation that it's not helpful to try and diagnose the story, as it will be just to describe the logic behind what's happening. In the worst moments of emotional isolation, when I was really desperate for someone to talk to, I started talking to myself. I tried to visualize another me, a girl version of myself that could answer my questions about why I felt what I did. However, I was tormented tremendously by the thought that I cannot know anything that I don't know, meaning no matter how I try to bifurcate my personality to better treat myself, I can't create a version of me that knows a thing I didn't already know somewhere inside. Moreover, finding myself becoming the kind of person that might be talking to myself was terrifying. And I spent a considerable amount of mental energy on rationalizing why it didn't make sense for me to do it, and thus rejecting my own attempts to cope with increasingly self-generated distress. From the chaos and confusion of that year was created the foundations of who I would become for the rest of my life. And all of that culminated in seeing Neon Genesis Evangelion shortly before I turned 15 and being like, this is the truth. It is incredible to me the way that Perfect Blue and Evangelion have such similar reputations, but with so little connection to one another. Whereas shows like Serial Experiments Lain, which follow similar themes, feel like they exist because Evangelion had set a precedent for their existence, Perfect Blue was already in development before Evangelion aired. It was almost entirely created as an OVA, which was expected only to appeal to a niche market, because there was not any expectation that a realistic psychological thriller would succeed as an animation in Japan. However, by the time the film was being finished, not only was there now precedent for the success of psychological thriller animation, not only in the case of Evangelion, but also the hugely popular Ghost in the Shell film from that same year, but it also must have become apparent to the people making the film that it was just ridiculously good. After all, remember, this was Satoshi Kon's full directorial debut, after Madhouse president Masao Maruyama had taken an interest in him based on his episode direction on the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Stardust Crusaders OVA. How could anyone have predicted that he was going to turn out one of the greatest films ever made until they saw it for themselves? Satoshi Kon was truly like Hayao Miyazaki in the way that his importance to the ability of his films to be made is such that they just couldn't exist at all without him. Even though he never read the original Perfect Blue book and only had the mostly accurate preliminary script to go off of, which involved a lot of idols and a lot of blood, neither of which he was especially interested in, Kon convinced the author to let him change the story into something that he thought would work better in animation, and he introduced most of the psychological and experimental mind-bending aspects to the story, which he had already been playing with in his manga Opus and in his work on JoJo, and which he would push to new levels across the rest of his work. His storyboards practically look like the finished animation, and so his creative mark on every image of the film is indelible. It may as well be considered a one-to-one adaptation of a manga that he drew, but in storyboard form. After Satoshi Kon's death, Masao Maruyama spent nearly a decade, even through his stepping down from Madhouse and the formation of Mappa Studio, looking for a director who could finish Kon's last film, The Dreaming Machine, and he never succeeded. Nothing else which even remotely resembles Kon's work has been created by anyone else, and if anything, we've gotten farther away from any semblance of those stylistic ideas appearing in animation. In fact, Kon's influence has been more clearly recognized in live-action film, from the likes of die-hard fans of his like Darren Aronofsky and the Wachowskis, who are also directors whose works helped me to find my place in reality as I ground through the rest of high school, which is when I developed the lifestyle I now still have of looking for myself all the time in art and analyzing what I find online. Mima's conversations with the ghost of herself as a pop idol are the scenes most mysterious and open to interpretation in the film. So let me posit my theory, which mainly boils down to that this is a weird form of acting practice. Acting doesn't necessarily require a total mental break to accomplish, but I really think it must help, that there's very much a kind of person that finds themselves in front of cameras. Again, I run the risk of oversimplifying if I start trying to give a diagnosis, but what I'm trying to communicate is mostly that I think what Mima experiences here is a version of a thing that plenty of people have probably dealt with, especially within her industry. I think her decision to stick with it in the end is because she really understands that all of this is part and parcel of the experience of getting to her goal, making her almost psychopathically driven if you think about it unsympathetically. After Mima throws a fit in her room about how she didn't really want to do that scene is when we first see the apparition of her old self, teasing her that she is no longer her true self. Immediately after this, we get to watch the press tour where Mima tells a truth that sounds like a lie. She had reservations, of course, but she knew what this scene would do for her career, and it worked. So she gets to talk about it as the huge success in her intention that it was, aside from that emotional scar that it left on her and those who project onto her as though she were themselves. I don't think that the Mima who is bragging about the scene on TV and the Mima who is lamenting the experience are incongruous with one another. It's understandable how she can hate the methodology and love the success, but from the perspective of anyone that isn't totally aware of her intentions, it is unmistakable how the person that she portrays herself in this role hardly even resembles the way that she was acting when she was a pop idol. Personality and communication are inherently performative aspects of the human experience. Your actions and feelings are governed by instincts, and the way that you explain those actions and feelings to other people is what gives you a sense of personality. Knowing that everyone else has their own personality and their own understandings and expectations of reality, it makes perfect sense that people tend to adopt different personalities when communicating with different people. Usually, you don't talk to your parents the same way you talk to your partner, and so on and so forth. But what kind of personality would you put on if you wanted to communicate with more people than you could ever possibly know personally? It's incredibly difficult to formulate a persona which resonates with a large number of people without being so watered down as to lack a sense of depth. Hello Kitty is about as popular as a character can be, and is entirely defined by the fact that it's the cutest cat drawing anyone's come up with as of yet. She has an almost limitless amount of very shallow appeal, but she will never appeal to anyone other than whoever likes this cute drawing of a cat. Actors have the opportunity to reach more people than anyone else because they can embody multiple whole different characters and lend them depth. When you combine something as broadly, generically appealing as an action hero with that very specific appeal that a charismatic actor brings, you've got the just right level of humanity to appeal to an inhuman number of people. Mima's pop idol Ghost is, to me, an attempt for Mima to remove herself from the person that other people believe her to be based on her past persona. After all, Mima's self-doubt about her career is amplified massively by the people who are actively working against these changes, and so she has to fight through both herself and them to get to where she's trying to go. Even though Mima does not think that she is defined by the persona that she used to portray, the people who keep insisting that the old Mima is the true Mima convince her at the very least that she really isn't the same person that she was, and now she is essentially at war with that former perception. Or maybe this is my own projection. I've seen this film in multiple stages of my own entertainment career, and I ended up relating in new ways every time that I see it from having that many more of these experiences. Actors are heralded so heroically and paid so well because their job is almost fucking incomprehensible to everyone, usually including themselves. From a psychological perspective, you can't explain why people can act. At best, you could explain why one person could play the roles that they did. If it is something you could just teach or do on purpose, everyone would be doing it. But most of us are doing it more so by accident, even if we're good at it. A compulsive liar doesn't choose to tell someone lies over and over again. Their instinct just keeps telling them to give untrue information, and they follow that instinct whether they realize that they're really doing it or not. It doesn't matter from my perspective how different the characters of Digibro and Trixie actually seem to my audience. They are the result of how I am capable of communicating. All of that is my long-winded explanation to suggest that Mima seeing the ghost of her past self is not a sign of mental deterioration so much as it is a challenge being posed to herself about whether she really has the strength to accomplish her new supposed goals. Does she really want this lifestyle change enough to put up with all this bullshit? Can this new character outlast the old one? The voices of doubt from the outside and the inside combine to form a new persona, a character that Mima can separate herself from and say, that isn't me. That's a version of who I used to be, and I'm better than her now. Perfect Blue is such a different experience when you have a proper understanding of the plot than it is on a first-time viewing that it's worth describing the film from both perspectives. After the slate of interviews in which Mima brags about her popular rape scene, the stalker stagehand writes a page on her site insisting that she didn't want this and is being forced into all of it, while begging for help through the internet. Seeing this partly convinces Mima of the possibility that she is somehow manifesting her true negative feelings about her career into this blog, and maybe writing it secretly in the times when she's breaking away from reality. This keeps happening more and more after the writer of the rape scene is found with his eyes gouged out in an elevator. If you've seen the film, you know this was the stagehand's work, but the film doesn't show us the killer so that we have plausible deniability to Mima's own suspicion that she is somehow responsible for this deep down. As the days go on, her paranoia starts to drag away her grip on reality, which coincides perfectly with her casting on TV as a girl whose trauma caused a bifurcation in her personality between a ruthless murderer and a personality that thinks herself to be the sister whom she actually murdered. While I can't call Mima mentally healthy in this period of the film, and her paranoia seems to be sapping away at her liveliness, I also can't help feeling that this still is all somehow something she's doing on purpose at some subconscious level. Mima really is just that good an actress. Everyone thinks so when they see her perform, but what it takes for her to get there is ruthless self-torment. She allows the aspects of her own life which connect her to her character to inform her mentality, such that she becomes more and more like the character in every aspect of her everyday life. That's an especially scary place to be, too, when real people are really getting murdered by someone pretending to be you. Aside from having no recollection of killing anyone, how could you really convince yourself that you weren't responsible for this when it plays into your own psychosis so perfectly? Of course, knowing the story and that it's all really Rumi's doing, it starts to more so resemble a battle between the instincts of these two women over the body and soul of Mima. Rumi thought that she could break Mima psychologically and drive her away from acting, but everything she does to try to draw Mima further into psychosis just ends up making her a more successful actor, and so Mima keeps diving deeper into the perfect blue and drawing up those experiences to propel herself even further. I think now's a good point to think about why the hell are we drawn to movies like this? What is so enjoyable about watching these fictional characters suffer, and to see all these shocking images which have sat in my mind for nearly 20 years now? After all, when I was 13, it was the first time in my life I had ever started to look at violent or mature media, which had always scared me shitless up to that point, and it still does for the most part when I see some fuck shit like The Boys. So why have I subjected myself to 3 whole seasons of that show's horribly gut-churning sensations? We've all heard the adage that whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Aside from how you can get antibodies from beating a sickness, this doesn't actually usually apply physically. Whatever damage you take probably makes you permanently less capable in a certain way. But the idiom is mostly devised out of the idea that emotional anguish better prepares you for more emotional anguish. Around the moment you see a piece of media where someone you care about dies and you realize that people you care about are also going to die is when you start preparing yourself for that inevitability. And for many, the only way to really compartmentalize the breadth of fuck shit that they're going to face in their lives is to get a thrilling secondhand experience of as much of it as possible, just in case they need to know what to do when the time comes. When I saw Perfect Blue at 13, it was so far over my head that only the broadest themes about exploitation in the media industry had reached me, and mostly just through the severity of that one scene. Once it became a violent murder mystery, I had mostly lost the plot, and I didn't even register phrases like dissociative identity disorder in the script because I wouldn't even really know what that was until being fascinated by the concept in Boogie Pop and others like a year later. Trauma-based dissociation has been something like a special interest for me ever since then, and is the human condition I have the most curiosity in exploring, leading to that feeling of overstanding that I have for these scenes in the film watching it now. Something a friend once told me that stuck with me as funny is that you're not meant to lean into your own mental illness, but to lean away from it. I mostly agree, especially if your mental illness is inspiring you towards criminal activity, but I also think there can be some utility to diving into yourself, really letting the gears turn, seeing what happens. Most of the effective and successful people in this world are not normal, and they do not operate by conventional behavioral playbooks. A lot of what works would look like madness if it wasn't working, and a lot of what looks like madness might actually work if it's in the right context. The hardest part is judging from within whether you are the right kind of crazy or not. On the one hand, everyone around Mima has every reason to exploit her mental state if it's turning out profitable performances. But on the other hand, that's not what anyone is setting out to do per se. No one is forcing her hand, and in fact plenty of people are begging her to change course, but Mima keeps deciding over and over to keep pushing forward and breaking herself further from reality on the basis of her reaffirmation from onlookers. What I think is that on some level, Mima must have always known that she was like this. She must have always had some dissociative tendencies, and she's letting that aspect of herself come to the forefront so she can try to understand it. And it might not even have been something she was having so much trouble with if outside forces weren't complicating it. Stalker Stagehand murders the TV writer on the basis of his expectation that Mima will return to performing with Cham immediately as a result. That doesn't happen, but he's become so delusional that he convinces himself it actually has, which reads very ironically for us viewers because we've just had it made very clear that Mima cannot possibly ever rejoin that band, which has had a total image change since then and way more success without her to the point of becoming radio personalities on top of singers. Meanwhile, Mima has submitted herself to a model photo shoot and let them convince her to get naked, failing to realize that if she gave them a bunch of great full-bearing nude photos, then that is all they are going to use. It's worth noting that the other girls in Chem joke behind her back about her that she probably will show literally everything. And while they're clearly mocking her, you can also tell in their tone and in the result that they are totally serious and correct to think that, because that's what Mima did. It's interesting that the two people who were closest to Mima before the start of this career are the ones least surprised by the way that she's been developing since leaving the group. They're like, yeah, we knew she was like this. When the Stalker stagehand sees the magazines, he goes around trying to buy up all of them before anyone else can see, presumably hoping to rescue his idol's long-gone purity. Faced by evidence that Mima can't possibly be who he thinks she is, he is driven only further into denial by the manipulations that he's getting through what seems like Mima's valid email. These emails are both the biggest red herring and also the biggest smoking gun about who's really causing all the mischief in this film. If you were accepting the idea that Mima could have mentally broken after the trauma of performing the rape scene in the same way that the character she's performing in the show has done, then you could be suspicious that she somehow is orchestrating her own torture in the moments when she's lapsing out of reality. But knowing that it's actually Rumi sending the emails, it becomes clear how this guy is actually just being exploited for his mental illness by someone who's convincing him that they actually are the real Mima and that the one he sees in the magazines is an imposter who needs to die. Among the most famous scenes in this film is when a presentation of Mima invades the nude photographer's house and gruesomely murders him with an ice pick. We never exactly learn who actually committed this crime. It seems safe enough to assume that it wasn't really Mima, even if she herself has a hard time being convinced that after finding evidence that it could have been her in her closet. It's possible that stagehand Stalker committed this crime under orders from Rumi, but it's also possible that Rumi did this one entirely herself, as there is less to suggest that this was the Stalker than there was in previous incidents of violence in the film. When the stagehand writes the Mima's Room blog, he mouths out the words and hears them in Mima's own voice, implying that he considers himself to be embodying her when he writes. Would he also project this way when committing a crime? There are scenes where he hears Mima's voice from the posters on his wall, sees illusions of her in front of or beside him, but these are always assuring him that Mima will be with him, rather than that he literally is her. Mima to him seems more like an imaginary companion based on what he sees in her, rather than a replacement for himself, which is how Fumi will reveal that she sees her by the film's end. I think that whenever someone becomes obsessed with a thing, it is because they see a huge aspect of themselves in that thing. But how much they can recognize this and how that feeling gets internalized is different for everyone. Most of my early fascinations sat in subconscious all the time, but I never really tried to understand why or what the commonalities between those obsessions were until later in life. Mostly I find it's a fascination with evolution, transformation, and duality in shows like Power Rangers, Transformers, Pokemon, Jurassic Park, and Godzilla, which were all of my early obsessions. Although Fumi and the stagehand connect to Mima in different ways, I think there is coordination in their mental image of her, with stagehand's perception also being warped by Fumi pretending to communicate with him as Mima. It's never clear if Rumi has always been writing to this guy as Mima to give him the info that he uses on the site, since it's so intimate and particular, or if he really has managed to find a way around her that much, given that he does tend to turn up a lot as a hand on her productions even before Mima starts hallucinating him there. Either way, it's obvious that both of these people idolize a similar version of Mima and that they are working together against the stagehand's knowledge to try and bring her back to life. Why is the Stalker stagehand so obsessed with Mima? There are plenty of beautiful idols, so what is it that draws him and Rumi to this one? I think ironically it's partly that they are all actors. They're all dissociatives with their own disconnects from reality that they recognize in one another subconsciously. This is something that only Mima knew about herself already, though, and which the other two want to deny. How many of my fans who hate me after transition do I think are battling with their own feelings of dysphoria, but believe that transition is running toward mental illness instead of running away from it? Most of them. The only reason I feel so differently from that is that I spent such a long time rotting inside trying to deny these feelings and have had such positive results after embracing them, which I don't even think will necessarily be true for everyone who's dealing with similar feelings. I totally get how seeing my transition from the perspective of someone who doesn't think they should give in to those feelings could seem like a personal fuck you to them. I think that my mind has become tremendously more clean since I stopped living in denial. No longer do I fear my feelings or what they might lead me to, because I understand them and I know what are my expectations of myself as a person. It is a lot easier for me to imagine how a trans person that always denies their feelings and creates a delusion to exempt themselves from their own self-expectations, just like anybody else who does that, will end up behaving toxically, as opposed to someone who faces themselves head on. None of this is to say that I think this character is trans or is even coded that way, but it is to say that whatever he's running from in himself is driving his obsession with Mima. The stagehand's attack on Mima is maybe the worst scene in the film, if only because it feels flat and actual in a way that doesn't distinguish it enough from the trashy feeling of the media that it's criticizing. All through this scene, he's got Mima mostly naked, and he keeps trying to rape her while she fights him off until eventually clocking him dead with a hammer. When she brings Rumi back to show what happened, the body isn't there. Presumably, Rumi removed it, and so she becomes convinced that this may have been illusory at Rumi's suggestion. I don't think this scene feels artful enough to consist of so much attempted sexual violence just as a kind of generic movie threat, but I do think it reveals the stalker's true nature. The stagehand is clearly a violent psychopath, and so in order to justify his nature, he needs to act in service of something that he considers morally abject and pure. Mima was chosen as his bastion of purity, and so violence in her name is to be celebrated. But why would Mima be his symbol for purity? Why not the other girls or any other idols? Well, probably because she's really, really hot. She's really open. She will literally bear it all. She is, in reality, an object to him. She is a kind of obelisk to his own sexuality. And she's his excuse for why he can't use his sexuality. This guy obviously wants to fuck Mima because he tries to do it as soon as he believes that he's morally justified in saving the real Mima from this fake. But if he really had what he thought was the real Mima, what would he really do to her? This is why I don't think that this character is trans, but rather more like a sanctimonious gooner. He won't admit he's a rapist and murderer because he wants to be the white knight and a hero, but his true nature is revealed in Rumi's manipulations. All of the release that he's never given himself, which everyone else gets by just jacking off to the pictures of Mima in magazines, explodes in these violent outbursts until the one that is silenced by Mima's club to the head. I think it's incredibly telling as well that in this moment it's confirmed that Mima does in fact have that dog in her, the capacity to kill someone, at least in self-defense. Could this also be something that the two murderers obsessed with her were able to somehow sense? Would it have been more true if they hadn't convinced her that she could have already been killing people? Has she actually become more like these people through the effects that they're having on her life? Mima's downward spiral was almost certainly worse than anything I've personally experienced, and not only because of the violence encircling it, but also because of how much she's dealing with it by herself. The person that she's closest to is not only working against her, but spending less time with her in that effort, and her family and friends are far away. Even if I may have been left with broken trust at the end of my relationship, I had felt empowered by the trust that I had had when that relationship was active, however misplaced it may have been. If I didn't have people who were around that could look at me and tell me I'm not that far gone, I don't know if I could have survived the complete desolation of trust in herself that Mima feels when she actually thinks that she is a mind-broken murderer. At last, we arrive at the most memorable scene in Perfect Blue, at least on first blush, the crazy climactic action sequence which folds reality and delusion in on one another in a visual feast of filmmaking. This is everything in the film coming to a head, and honestly, there's less to say about it now, considering how the information of this scene lends the perspective necessary to go back and analyze the rest of the film, as I've been doing. Much of what happens in this scene is pure cinematic spectacle, dazzling and full of tension even on repeated viewings, as you really think about how much of this seemingly really happened. Mima did in fact seemingly fall several stories and get stabbed twice. I like to think that the time that she would have spent gasping on the ground in reality is the amount of time that it actually took Rumi to get down the stairs. And so that illusion of her gracefully leaping after Mima is just her perception of continued threat coming after her. But that's just getting really interpretive on my part. The series of reveals all starts with Mima realizing that she's not in her apartment. She's in a facsimile of what her apartment looked like before her career change, with her fish still living and her Cham poster still on the wall. But Mima realizes what's happening because she sees the unfamiliar view from the apartment window. She's confronted by a vision of herself from the past, but dressed in what is supposedly the group's new costume. And only through seeing Rumi's reflection in the mirror does she realize the truth of the situation. Most interesting to me about this sequence is how Mima's illusion is not broken by the realization that it's actually Rumi attacking her, and the truth is only ever revealed in reflections, usually which serve to show us the ways in which Rumi cannot completely imitate Mima, mostly because she's out of shape and she can't fit into Mima's costume or keep up with her escape. Rumi is pushing herself way beyond her physical limitations in order to embody Mima because she is completely broken away from the Rumi personality at this point, and she only believes herself to be Mima full-time, which will be explained at the end of the film. I think the switch likely came when she murdered Mimania and then Mima's producer, piling their bodies in the parking garage with the eyes carved out. It's possible Mimania had already died from the blow to the head, but it seems more likely to me that Rumi finished the job when she gouged him. I think this presentation is more than just to tell the viewers what's happening with Rumi, though. It seems like Mima literally cannot unsee herself in Rumi except in those small moments, such as when she gets her hand around Rumi's throat, and her face starts morphing back to reality until she gets the ice pick into Mima's shoulder. There's no way to parse how much of this kite-like action sequence falling all the way into the streets of Tokyo could possibly be really happening, but it's obvious that Mima's delusions have been ramped up to a fever pitch in this manic escape, all until the moment she finally gets to see herself, her real self, in the reflection of a window and realizes what she really looks like right now. When Mima sees Rumi in the reflection, she is visibly pissed before dodging another attack from Rumi's bladed umbrella, which shatters the window. This is clearly the other shoe dropping moment for Mima, when she's realized that all of her mental anguish has just been caused by this crazy bitch coming up behind her. If not for Rumi's machinations, Mima may have never been haunted by her past self, or doubted her decisions, or felt any regrets about leaving Cham. But when her suppressed negative feelings were blown up into massive real-world consequences, she couldn't help feeling at fault and finding reasons to blame herself, which led her into delusions because there were no reasons to do so in reality. Now, all of that self-blame had a target. And it's not Mima. It's an imposter, a specter resembling a character she used to play, but being performed by someone else. When Rumi has Mima pinned to the wall, we see her as Mima again because that's how Rumi sees herself, and hers is the only relevant perception in that moment because Mima has her eyes closed. That is, until she rips Rumi's wig off, and the illusion is shattered for both of them. Rumi freaks the fuck out, and in trying to reclaim the wig, impales herself on a huge glass shard, then wanders into the street wailing in pain until she's nearly hit by an oncoming truck that to her looks like stage lights. When Rumi looks back, all covered in blood, in another iconic shot, Mima realizes that she's still in the delusion that she is Mima, and decides to rescue her at the last moment. Is it because Mima saw herself in Rumi and wanted to protect herself, or because she wanted to save her friend from a delusion that she felt partially responsible for? After all, Rumi's version of her character had been pretty convincing, even to her. The short flash-forward conclusion establishes a few details about our character's futures. Rumi is in a mental care facility and still completely in the delusion that she has been a teen pop idol named Mima. Meanwhile, Mima has become a famous actress, the spitting image of the woman that she had admired on set, and confident in her own reality as a human. I think ending an animated film with a character declaring "I'm real" feels almost destined as the way that Satoshi Kon would have ended his first movie. Like, I wouldn't even be surprised if that was one of the first ideas he had when writing, because it's just the total essence of his stylistic voice. So now I'm done summarizing the events of this film finally, but in order to bring the big picture of the themes into focus, especially as they pertain to the theme of this video novel, we'll need to go back over some little details that I didn't give much attention to on the first pass. That actress who Mima looks up to, named Rei, has too little screen time to really get a sense of her character. She mostly fills a symbolic role as the icon of Mima's development as an actress, to the point that Mima has clearly ripped her stees by the film's end. That's right, I still say stees. Rei is presented only as a consummate professional leading lady TV actress in a primetime procedural drama, with more dialogue doing exposition about the show within a show than she gets in the reality of the film. She's a little bit annoyed with Mima's unprofessionalism at first, but she isn't too mean about it, and ultimately she seems happy to have worked with Mima by the time they're wrapping the show. For the third fourth of the film, when Mima is lapsing through reality and fantasy, she keeps confusing moments from her real life with moments from the show, and the diagnosis of her character seems to apply to her actual life as well. Interesting to me is that Ray kind of seems to get what's happening there. Like maybe she's dealt with this before as an actress. And the most powerful dialogue between the two of them is just a few lines that they share in the studio hallway right before Mima gets attacked by Mimania. Mima accidentally calls her Toko-san, which is the name of her character, and Rei reminds her that she's not Toko-san anymore. She then quotes her line from the show, "There is no way illusions can come to life," while looking Mima dead in the eyes, and then tells her that she needs to wake up soon. I can only see this as Rei completely understanding where Mima is at right now, because of her own life, the script of the show, or both, and giving her what she sincerely considers the advice that Mima needs right now, and obviously we all know she's right. Much has been said rightfully about this film's commentary on exploitation, male gaze, idol culture, work culture, the entertainment industry, psychosis, and all of the other dark, negative, and difficult subjects that the film tackles. But I'm not sure enough has been said about the film's theme of self-empowerment and actualization, and about just how much of a badass Mima really is throughout this whole movie. One of the biggest complaints about this movie that I agree with is how its villains are portrayed as physically unattractive or deformed, in a way that really stands out in a movie with realistic designs where not every character is designed to be attractive in the first place. I think this film uses deformity to make us feel uneasy as viewers in a way that's unfortunate, but it's not at all what's wrong with the characters, and the message of the film could have possibly been better conveyed with different designs. I'm going to go into detail about why I think these designs were chosen from an artistic perspective, and then I'll get into how I would change that if I wanted to fuck up a classic masterpiece of a film to suit my personal modern cucked political preferences. You know, because this movie should be more comfortable for me and not make me feel bad about what it has to say. To me, Perfect Blue is slightly less of a film about exploitation at the hands of society than it is about exploitation at the hands of oneself. And moreover, it is dangerously encouraging in this regard. Mima is a winner in this film. She gets everything she wants and she's happy at the end, even though everyone who got her where she is was killed or went insane. I don't think it's even a little weird to call her kind of a sociopath, massively a narcissist, and totally a role model at the same time, you know, a celebrity. When we meet Mima at the start of the film, she's clearly been busting her ass nonstop for 2.5 years trying to make something pop that just isn't hitting. She's working way too hard for rapidly diminishing returns, which were never that high in the first place. Maybe she even knew that Cham had a better shot without her, but it certainly didn't seem like she had much of a shot in Cham, considering she wasn't even the lead singer. If anything, it seems like her place was to be the hot one. Even the hottest girl in the world can't stake her future on being hot forever though, and the image of the band is already starting to feel young compared to the girls when they're in their 20s. Rumi's insistence that Mima could stay in Cham, along with the disappointed Mima fans, are simply deluded compared to the reality of her situation from her and her producer's perspective. At this point in life, the real decision Mima is making is between whether she will continue in the entertainment industry at all, or just go back to her hometown and get a normal job, which she's clearly got no interest in doing based on her annoyed conversations with her mom. If Mima was an explosively talented actress already, that quality would have been discovered. As it is, she is considered acceptable in bit roles and mostly in places where she can land the role on the strength of her beauty. Her acting career begins in desperation, but she is immediately inspired by Ray in such a fashion that she ends up dedicating herself to acting with the same single-minded devotion that she had given to singing and dancing in years prior. But considering the deep-end plunge that she's taking into hardcore dramatic acting and artsy pornography, it's maybe not surprising that trying to become a whole new person whose job is becoming whole new other people kind of breaks her mind a bit, especially considering the insane outside forces pushing against her. When you think about everything Mima overcomes in this movie to become a successful actress, you can only call her a badass. Even if you took away from Mima's career that she was only so popular because she's so hot, I still think it takes stupendously more effort to be as hot as Mima is than really anyone wanted gives credit to, unless they understand the modeling industry. Beautiful women are fairly commonplace in this world. Kick a Starbucks cup down an empty street in San Diego, and the most attractive woman you've ever seen will catch it in mid-jog. I think the physical innate traits of beauty are in fact present in everyone who's alive, and what we consider beautiful is basically just when you don't have to look for it very hard. Still, every woman with a nice rack and a pretty face wants to be the it girl without any effort. So the only ones that actually are going to make it are the ones who do put effort in, just like with any other profession. It's not just about being attractive, but about the way that you're attractive, what you reflect back into the people who feel a pull towards you. Mima isn't isn't just hot or just a decent actress, but she has a somethingness, a certain quality that draws people to wanting to see her naked or see her pretending to lose her mind instead of someone else. And I'm going to try to pin that down as much as I can because, unlike with real people, Mima was deliberately constructed to come off a certain way by the staff of the film and isn't just nebulously charismatic. To really get into the mind of Mima, there is one more place to look that I always missed until I realized I would have to carefully read the lyrics to the one song that she ever got to sing for Cham. There is no explanation in the film for whether she had any hand in writing these songs, but considering how the first Poppy Cham song we hear is mostly about the hot-blooded never say die attitude which I've already characterized Mima with, I think it's fair to expect the lyrics of her song to say something about her as well. We only make it through a little more than half of a verse in this song about a past heartbreak and the place that it's left the singer emotionally. The lyrics describe what had been an empowering and perhaps obsessive relationship. We don't know anything about the other person or how the relationship ended, as the verse skips right from describing how the memories of the time that they were in love were everything to her, to describing how reflecting on that period in her life today reveals how she has become a coward, choosing to live a life that she can't feel anymore. That lyric about her current state is imposed over her returning to her apartment in a sequence that establishes her regular commute, implying that this is indeed the life that she is not feeling anymore. Mima's work as presented in this film is always hyper-informed by her present personal feelings. The whole energy of Cham had probably been informed by the bubblegum love that Mima was feeling for a partner that she had at the time the band was formed. But since she lost that love, and being left only with its ghost in the lingering image of the band, she no longer feels connected to Cham as a work of art, and the one song that she got to sing with the group and perform before leaving is basically an admission of that. Looking at it this way, Mima's departure from Cham feels even more inevitable than just a matter of circumstance and what's possible for her in the industry. Instead, it feels like Mima is in search of a new creative outlet to express the way that she feels now after her disillusionment with her time as an idol. Once Mima has decided that she wants to become a serious dramatic actor, the question becomes, what is she going to do to make that happen? And all of the pathways that are open to her suck. However, they are also learning experiences, and she becomes a serious actor through this gruesome trial by blood. Whether it's exploitive writers, producers, cameramen, and editors, fans turned ops, or psychotic stalkers, Mima is willing to push through all of that if that's what it takes to get where she's trying to be, which is a person who can carry themselves with the sense of dignity and grace that Ray does and be understood and beloved by as many people as possible. Before she is exploited by anybody else, Mima is exploited by herself. She feels like shit after doing the rape scene and realizing how traumatic it really is, but when the ratings come in, she doubles down and goes all in on actress mode. She hates that the magazine she did the photo shoot for printed just the raciest nudes, but she was the one who gave the cameraman total access to her body just as her friends predicted she would, knowing her personality. When Mima is encircled by crime, she kind of helps to keep it under wraps by never going public about the letter bomb or telling anybody that she found bloody clothes in her closet, assuming that that really happened, but even if she only thought it did, she probably should have turned herself in for questioning at that point. Even after a point when she is sure that these murders are connected to her, and even halfway convinced that she could be causing them directly as another persona, she does not take a break from this intense new career or seek any help at all. There's definitely some heavy commentary on the toxicity of Japanese work culture in this film, and if you view everyone rightfully as mostly a victim of their own culture, then you can say that it's mostly a statement on society at large. But I think it's important as well to the film's message that Mima is a full participant in this system and is happy with where it gets her in the end, without really regarding herself as a victim, going so far as to say that Rumi made her who she is in the end. And so I think it's fair to consider her as a part of the problem in perpetuating all of these exploitative systems. Much of culture is derived from the human desire to justify our own existence. Below culture is this base layer of surviving on instinct, but the collective discovery of what can be accomplished when instinct is honed and put to creative purpose has led us to generate culture on top of it, an organization by which effort is directed beyond that which is necessary merely to survive. Most of the time, culture victimizes the people who belong to it, preparing them not to be the best versions of themselves possible, but the best fit for the culture that they are going to inhabit. Culture is unavoidable at this point, but it's also incredibly broad, so there's a lot more room for people to run around looking for their place inside of it. Culture and language dually reveal the innate human ability and inability to understand one another. If we really understood one another, we wouldn't need language. But through language, we can cultivate a shared understanding that lets us participate together in being parts of the same whole. They say there is a strength in numbers because if they didn't believe it, they wouldn't say anything at all. Who the fuck is they? Mima, the pop idol, is a cultural artifact in the same way that Digibro is. A thing that represents an aspect of a person at a place in time, and which could connect with others across space and time who understood some aspect of that character. Rumi and Mimania connected appropriately with Mima's message in a way. They were both as driven to achieve love as she is, and also they heard her call to be freed from a life that doesn't satisfy her, even if they misunderstood which life that is and wouldn't listen to her when she said it. You can never really predict who your messages will reach, especially at a large scale, but there will always be a combination of those who get it exactly like you want them to, and those who feel just as strongly about their totally wrong interpretation. I will never get the chance to know how Kon Satoshi might have felt about my interpretation, and I really hope he's comfortable in his grave having trippy dreams as I speak. I don't think personally that Mima deserves any blame for the actions of her psychopathic fans, but I think that Mima does feel responsible, and that victim self-blame is another underspoken part of this film. Why Japanese work culture is so poisonous is that it makes you feel like you can't live up to the top standards set by those around you, and so you're broken and unfit to be there. Mima cries out in her fit over the rape scene that she felt obligated to the hard work everyone around her is doing, and that pressure is coming more from inside herself than it is from externally, where her manager is actively arguing against her pursuits, and everyone's constantly asking if she's sure that she wants to go through with this. Realistically, none of us ever had a shot at the top. The more you learn about what it takes to seize the levers of power, the more comfortable you tend to become as a cultural captive. We are all genetic refugees from a pre-cultural time, sleeping in whichever camp will let us, usually wherever we started. One more thing needs to be said of this movie before I can end this video. The fucking name. What does it mean? Why don't the words perfect or blue ever appear in the movie? What did they mean in the original book? What is a perfect blue? In the purest sense, the aspect of Mima's personality and of Japanese culture which this film most sets out to critique is perfectionism. It prods at different perspectives on perfection, what it means, what it leads to in people, and where it will land you. It's not about perfection of a singular work or form, like how the legendary chef Jiro dreams of sushi, but rather about trying to create a perfect sense of self. A feeling of completeness about who you are and where you fit into society. Where do we get our ideas of perfection? We want to believe there is a totalizing version of any given thing, a thing which can't be improved upon. But the concept is so metacognitive that it has no real application in reality. Who the hell can say what a perfect thing is? Why would we ever let someone be the authority on what is or isn't perfect? What are you really telling someone when you say that something is perfect? And will it mean anything to them if you don't explain yourselves after saying it? I have argued my whole career against attempted calls to objectivity in describing pretty much anything because there is no way to be the arbiter of what is objective. Smart people can't even decide if reality is real or not, or how the universe started. Why the hell would any of us be able to make a statement on the nature of something being real? Still, I know that people are not being this actually meta when they call something objectively good or even perfect. What they're mostly trying to say is that it lives up to the accepted standard or is, in their opinion, the best of anything they've encountered yet. With all of that in mind, I would know what someone meant if they told me that Perfect Blue was a perfect movie, or that Kon Satoshi was a perfect director. After all, it's so goddamn hard to imagine how it could be done any better. But I did promise I would try, right? Japanese media tends to misunderstand and make fun of fat and ugly people, in part because their culture and appearances are deliberately so massively homogenized. But I'm American, where you're very much allowed to be fat and everyone is ugly, and I've personally had plenty of experience with being both fat and ugly throughout my life, so I think I'm fit to speak on how this film misuses these traits. Rumi does not strike me as a kind of person who would want to be just like Mima. She clearly wants to be close to her and is obsessed with her, but actually coming to embody her completely doesn't seem in line with what her life has been up until Mima's career shift. Maybe she was okay with just projecting onto Mima and then upon losing her felt that there needed to be a replacement, so she became one in desperation, but how is she so capable of convincing her that she's just like Mima when she's actually so different? I think it would have made a lot more sense for the criminal to end up being someone more similar to Mima in obvious ways, who more obviously wishes that she could be just like her. It would still be her manager because she wouldn't want to have to compete with Mima inside of the band. She wants Mima's place in the band specifically, but she can't fill it because she doesn't believe herself to be as talented as Mima is. And so the reveal that even Mima isn't good enough to hack it in the industry would be the real crushing blow to that character who felt abandoned in their own ambitions by Mima giving up. I feel like we're most of the way to that being what the movie already is, and I can also understand how if Rumi was more obviously similar to Mima, it would have been way more immediately obvious to smart viewers that she was the killer, instead of the unassuming manager, Rumi. I can't even confidently argue from that vantage point that Perfect Blue would be a better movie if it made more sense in this regard, but it would at least make it more accessible to certain audience members. Likewise with Me Mania, it doesn't add that much to the film or to him for him to be creepy looking, other than adding a sense of tension to the movie about what the weird guy might do. And honestly, it's so on the nose with him that I was more surprised he even turned out to be a bad guy than I was by the idea that he was a red herring. I do think that the film wants us to partially understand that Mima is prejudiced against this guy because of his appearance, but, well, again, that prejudice ends up being justified because he's actually a bad guy. So I think the suggestion of a link between his physical deformity and mental illness is the most unfortunate presentation in this film. The guy who broke into my house was an incredibly normal-looking dude, just as psychopaths typically are, and Me Mania has clearly always been a guy looking for an excuse to beat people up on a hot girl's behalf. If the movie was rearranged so that it didn't feel so hard on ugly people, would it be a better movie? More perfect? It's pointless to speculate because that movie doesn't and will never exist outside of the realm of fantasy, and illusions can never come to life. We have the movie that we have, and it's as good as it's ever going to get. So it is perfect in the sense that it is what it is, and it will not ever change. But who cares what I think about perfection? How would I even know if I saw it? Who can really know what was missing from a work besides the person with the original vision? How could I ever know the difference between what is accomplished by a person and what is, in their own minds, perfect? In Breadsword's video about Lupin III, The Castle of Cagliostro, they justify their declaration of the film's perfection while also revealing how, for director Miyazaki Hayao and the staff who created it, the memory of making the film is more sour and more about what they had to deal with negatively, which opens up a whole other can of worms and the modern cultural question of whether a work can even really be considered perfect unless it was also achieved by perfect means and by perfect people. And so now, at long last, it is time. I am done talking about Perfect Blue. This was originally going to be a video in which I compared it extensively to The Wind Rises, but after I wrote about Perfect Blue, I realized they weren't as comparable in the ways that I thought they were as I had first thought, and also that I had way more to say about Perfect Blue than I first thought, so I've made it its own video. Maybe I'll talk about The Wind Rises someday, but I can't make any promises. Thanks again for watching, everybody. Please use my link tree. Please read my magazine. Please check out all the stuff down there. I'm not going to bore you any longer. You're already trying to click away. Get to your next video. This has been Trixie the Golden Witch. Anime forever.